Hey everybody, Sina Kahen here, and I've actually nominated myself this week to share some thoughts on the Parasha because it's one of my favorites. And it's one of my favorite because I think it represents one of the most important developments in human awareness. And I hope as I develop the idea, you come to take away some things from it or come to the same conclusion. As we saw from last week, our ancestors are suffering. They're enslaved, they're in bondage in Egypt. But in Vaera, the situation reaches almost a point of vengeance. As we go through the text, it becomes clear that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us in Egypt to know Him. It gets repeated again and again. V'yadatem ki ani Adonai Elohechem. And then again, later. V'yadu Mitzrayim ki ani Adonai. And then again later. Ku amar Adonai bezot teda ki ani Adonai. And it happens a few more times where God is saying, you'll get to know me. So in what way do we get to know Him? And once we answer this, what exactly does this knowledge lead us to? What benefit, if any, does it provide to us or the world? And we ultimately get to know HaKadosh Baruch Hu through the plagues, from the blood-filled Nile to the bodily boils. Later, as we see the death of the Egyptian firstborns, we come to know God through the 10 disasters that cripple Pharaoh and Egypt. And it's really interesting to note that each of these 10 plagues violate or impact the way in which Egyptians perceived much of nature. It impacted Egyptian understanding of biology, of geology, of pathology, and so on. And I don't think this was a coincidence at all, because the polytheistic Egyptians, we have to remember, they designated and worshipped different gods for each of these different categories. The Encyclopedia on History states, and I quote, "The Egyptian gods, for the Egyptians, represented the personification of the surrounding nature." So what we come to realize then is that these 10 plagues, they're not just about defending Israel. They're simultaneously a direct attack upon the theological foundations of Egypt. And the Midrash Rabbah points this out. It asks, why were the waters first attacked? And it answers, because Pharaoh and the Egyptians worshipped the Nile. So with every plague that appears, we see another god of Egypt being shown to be nothing but a figment of Egyptian imaginations. And I think we should stop for a second and think about this. Why was it so necessary for us in Egypt to learn that all these different elements of nature are controlled by one God? Is there a general benefit to this transition from believing in a plethora of gods governing different elements of nature to this monotheistic reality that there is a single source of all existence? I would argue yes, there's a huge benefit, because ultimately the unity of monotheism is at the very core of the most important discoveries of mankind. Robert Fuller, the well-known physicist, stated it beautifully, that monotheism is the theological counterpart of the scientist's belief in the ultimate reconcilability of apparently contradictory observations into one consistent framework. So in other words, the belief in a single source of existence is fundamental to the discoveries of every scientist out there. Rav Matis Weinberg wrote in his frameworks that, he asks, did you ever wonder why, that of all the civilizations that grew throughout history, only monotheistic civilizations developed fundamental science? Why is this? Let's think about it. What does a polytheistic view of reality, the view that the Egyptian had and we had, what did it look like? You've got different gods, you've got different components of the world, each with their own set of different laws. There's no unity, there's no consistency. And Hacham Faur alav shalom in his Homo Mysticus points out that the compartmentalization of knowledge into discrete categories, disjointed from one another, reflects a polytheistic view of reality. Now let's contrast this to a vision of reality for the Hebrew, which is based on the unity and consistency of monotheism, where there's a primal existence, Matsui Rishon, at the core of everything we experience and beyond. This is incredibly the exact unifying principle that Abarbanel says Pharaoh was unwilling to accept. Abarbanel, in his Perush, states, Pharaoh took issue with Moshe for 3 reasons. One of them being that Moshe assumed the existence of a necessary first cause, whereas Pharaoh denied it. So this monotheistic understanding of the world, which was first discovered by Abraham in Sefer Bereshit, it requires a world that's interconnected, that's linked between all of its various components. And this has an impact, many impacts on the contemporary scientist. 1, contradicts can't persist. 2, observations can't differ according to the person observing. There has to be a consistent, unified set of laws. 3, that in all the complexity around us, there's a simplicity behind it. And when the scientist realizes this, it's beautiful and moving. Albert Einstein realized this when he stated, "It is a wonderful thing to recognize the unity of a complex of phenomena that to direct observation appears to be quite separate things." That must have been what was happening to the Egyptian, who assumed of all these separate entities and suddenly saw unity in them all. How many times have we been involved in something like that, where it looks like a complete mess, complete and utter complex mess, or we understood it to be that way, but then when we actually analyze it carefully, we discover that, hold on, there's actually a simplicity or a method to the madness at the source behind all of it, and suddenly we see it. And I think this is what Rabbeinu Bachaya means when he says that all wisdom is one. Even though its signs may vary, he says, its foundation and essence is one. And I think this is why Hacham Nieto says that the word nature is a modern expression. Chazal do not use that word, because everything attributed to nature, he says, is due to the action of that first cause, God. So now let's come back to Vaera, and let's go back to the 10 plagues, and let's realize that the plagues represent much more than just the freedom of our people or some nice fireworks in the sky. The plagues ultimately led to the freedom of the human mind, because they led to the acknowledgement that all worldly effects, all elements of nature, as disjointed as they seem, are under the providence of a unified first cause, Matsui Rishon, which is what we call God. And I think we're reminded of this new stage of human awareness every single day in our tefillah, when we say Mashiv Haruach Omorit HaGeshem, he who causes the wind to blow and the rain to fall. Shabbat Shalom.